Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Monica McNally. I serve on the Board of Selectmen, and I'm also chair of the Great Island Committee, Advisory Committee, and I'm thrilled to be working with 8 other dedicated volunteers. I'll read their names to you. I'm going to just make sure I don't miss anyone. We have Mark Adaletta, Lori Bora, Mike Burke, Bruce Ferguson, Dan Kolakowski, Jim Palin, Jeff Table, and Kip Vesey. And I'd just like to give them a little round of applause. Thank you. So it's really hard to believe that it's been almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years on May 5th that we purchased this island. And to see all that we have accomplished since then. In June, last June, we hired Reed Hilderbrand for their expertise in creating public access while balancing the preservation of historic buildings and the ecological consideration and conservation, and they got right to work. Today marks our 3rd round of public outreach, including surveys and focus group conversations. We have approved the vision plan, and now we are embarking on phase 2, the master plan. And I hope you will all agree that this is important work that needs to be done carefully, and that the time and effort that is expended is worth it. And I hope you'll also agree that the public outreach of this process is very important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Becca Sturgis, who will explain the process for outreach for this event. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming this afternoon. It is absolutely generous of you to be here, and we are excited to have you listen for a bit right now, and then talk with all of us, ask questions, learn, participate, draw, play, whatever your particular desired way to spend the rest of the afternoon when we move into the gymnasium after this. Thank you, Monica, so much, and thank you to the Board of Selectmen and to everyone who leads and volunteers in this community. It has been an enormous honor to work with all of you, and we have seen levels of participation so far that are unprecedented in this kind of work at our practice. And so we hope that that will continue to be true in these final months together working with you. We are, at this moment, basically almost 2/3 of the way through the process, and we are launching into, in some ways, the most exciting and most specific part of finding the future for Great Island. So we have quite a large team, and I think many of you have participated so far, but I just want to say, I'm Becca Sturgis. I'm the principal in charge for Reed Hilderbrand. We have about another 22 people who are supporting us actively on a weekly basis, representative of civil engineers, ecologists, people who think about ADA access, people who understand what happens underneath the ground, all the invisible things that support daily life, like utilities. And then we have also really wrapped our arms around so many of the leaders in your community who know things that we don't know, like about local boating practices, for instance, or some of the challenges related to different invasive species that you struggle with in your public spaces. So I just want to say there are many, many people involved in the process. Many of them are here today, but there are many more, and just to recognize everything that they've contributed. So at this moment today, we're going to do 3 things with you. The basic one right now is just to update a little bit about where we are in the process. Next is to give you some idea of what we have learned, what we have realized seems to be true about the island, Great Island, and your community, and what are the exciting possibilities for the future of Great Island and Darien. And we are going to share 3 basic possibilities for us to talk about later today and throughout the survey. So just to show a calendar, this is representative of the last, this shows the last 6 months of our 1-year assignment for Great Island. As you can see, that yellow line, vertical line, is today. So there's still much to be done, but at this moment, we are starting to talk about specific things, like where would parking actually go if you put parking on the island? And that's the kind of specific thing that we want to start really getting into as we find a map for what will happen to the island going forward. Today is our public workshop. We'll have another one in May. May 17th is the date that has been identified. It will be further confirmed, but please hold that if you are interested in coming back in May. That meeting will be here and also on the island. We are, as part of where we are in this process, also looking to have a set of what we call experiential engagements, and those are things like tours of the island now that the weather is getting nicer. So some of that work will continue to happen. There are also something that we call focus group conversations, which is more small group conversations with sort of experts and volunteers in the community who have knowledge that we want to make sure that we hear about. And we've done many of those conversations already as part of this phase and as part of the vision phase which preceded this. We will have a few more of those conversations going forward. And then just to share, in June, we will wrap up our work and we will hand off at the very start of July a plan back to the Board of Selectmen, to our committee. And at that point, the leadership of the town will start making the hard decisions about exactly what to phase when and what allocations of monies and where those monies should come from make sense. And so just to share that this plan that we're working on now is about the big picture, what's most important over the long run for Great Island, and then there will be a process of deciding what needs to happen when. So after this afternoon, starting around 4:15, we will launch a survey based on the information that we're sharing today and in the gymnasium. We invite all of you to participate in that survey. There will be questions about how hungry or eager you are for things to happen in that survey. And so we really do hope that you all participate. And if you know others who you think really care, please urge them to participate in that survey. It will be open for 3 weeks. So just to sort of give some details about what's about to happen right now, we are beginning our discussion with you. This will wrap at around 3 o'clock. Then we will move over to the gymnasium where we'll have small group conversations. We have about 14 people from our team there with different topic experts for you to engage in and share your opinions. The survey will then launch. You can see that for the first survey, we had more than 2,000 respondents. We had roughly 1,500, maybe actually closer to 600 for the second survey. We are hoping that because there's so much detail and so much at stake with what we're about to discuss today, that we will have really high numbers again with this third survey. So, into some more detailed information. We completed the vision plan, and I'm happy to report that I think it was last week, the Board of Selectmen approved the vision part of this process. The vision is really what sets out the highest level of sort of general goals and agreements about what should happen at Great Island. And you can see here in a very succinct way, having a mosaic of experiences feels really important on Great Island. I think one of the things that people love about it so much now is that it feels very much like one island, but there's so much to discover. And so we don't want to make the island too homogeneous, we don't want to oversimplify, we want to keep some of that variety of experience that you have there now. And then I think moderation is something that the state of Connecticut is known for, and in some ways I think something we've experienced working with all of you is also a kind of moderation in the approach. And you can see we're trying to balance a lot of things as we go forward. And we asked a lot of questions about, do you really want Great Island to be more about preservation, or do you want it to be really dedicated to just ecology or the coast? And what we found as we worked with everybody is people really want a balance between ecology and keeping the historic structures, a balance between having some education on the island and some access to water, but really looking at a kind of weaving together of different priorities and different experiences in a very sensitive way that is respectful of everything that is there now. I think there's a real commitment to trying to not lose what makes the island remarkable today. So very clearly, we heard a desire for the list of things that are above here from the community. And so that means really trying to find a sensible way to support some level of community events on the island is a clear directive that has gone into the vision plan. Another one is to find some means to provide water access is another. A third is to walk. Most people who go to the island today walk, and it is absolutely magnificent as an experience today, and it is not a surprise to us that that was one of the most sought after things to make sure it continues to be a first-rate experience for people on the island. And then you can see this category of choices. There was a lot of sense that Great Island is not a place that should be over-programmed or over-committed. And while there are many things that people want and hope for in the community, I think there was deep recognition with all of the people who engaged that there are real choices to be made. And Great Island should not have everything and every kind of sport court and every kind of educational opportunity that could exist at Darien. That we want to be very, very selective about what we actually support on the island and when. So, in order to help make good decisions, the way we do that, many of you probably do this in your lives or at work, we basically assert a set of principles that all of the decisions need to conform to, or all the sort of future paths that we consider conform to. And so the principles that we have arrived at so far, most important, most transformative for Great Island, is this goal of really bringing people to the island. It has been a single family's home for a long time. It is not an island prepared to greet many, many people. It is not a space for a town yet. And so there are changes that are absolutely necessary for the island to welcome people, all of you. Second, really protecting and preserving the character and those diversity of experiences feels absolutely foundational to any future on the island. That prioritizing of people walking, pedestrians, that's something also that came out loud and clear. As you walk, as you meander on the island, there are all these ways to see the coast, sometimes down at the beach, sometimes up from the rocks, sometimes it's a distant view. That experience of being that close to the water in so many different ways is one of the things that makes the island feel like you might be off the coast of Maine or much, much further away than you actually are. And so ensuring that we continue to have that set of connections to the water is really important. All of these things that are so amazing about the island could be threatened if you sense cars. So, it's a challenge not having cars on the island because it makes it very hard for people to get there now. But if you're constantly worrying as you move about getting hit by a car or having your children hit by a car, that sense of beauty and quiet and getting away will go away. So we know we need to have cars on the island so that it can be used by the town. But we want to do everything within our capacity to minimize the sense that those cars are there. If we could make them invisible, that's what we would do. And then this sense that actually as you move, you may have never noticed this before, but there are moments where suddenly the edges come in, the rocks come in, you don't know exactly what is going to come next, and suddenly it opens up again. And it's completely breathtaking. And so ensuring that that sense of open and closed is preserved is another one of, that's more of a design rule, but that's another really important principle going forward. Two last ones, and I'll talk about them a little bit more with the next slide, but The historic fabric of the island gives this incredible sense of age and time and generation and beauty, and that is something that would be terrible to lose. And so preserving that and protecting it, the history of the island, is another one of our guiding rules. Then the last one is that we really want to concentrate all the activity in relatively small areas, right? So we give as much as we can to the community, but if we do that, cost less, lower impact from an environmental point of view, enormous positive consequences for the community, but much less loss of all that is beautiful that is there now. So these are just two historic photographs that we wanted to share. They're available online on the website if you want to look at them more closely. But they're taken roughly a little bit more than almost 30 years apart. And we wanted to share them because I think when the island was developed by the Steinkraus family, one of the things that happened was that they made a set of commitments based on the way that they were organizing their life, right? So stables and horses, the polo field, the clearing of large grounds and erecting large structures for horses was important. They also were largely self-sufficient on the island, and so growing an enormous amount of plants and food was really important. And so you can see on the western side of the island, by what is we call today the greenhouse building, all the fields and old glass house that they used to have. And so the sense then as you move over, you can hardly see it actually, particularly in the image from the 20s, the estate house was just carved out of the woods, right? And this idea that as we look back at the past history of development of the island, much was preserved as you move to the east and toward the beach and toward the woods, and much was cleared and developed for growing plants and for recreational activities closer to town and the causeways. And so you'll see as we share some of the possible futures with you today, in general, we're building off that past history of how the island was developed. One of the things that many of you probably already know is that when you look to change or you look to create an activity for humans on an island, you want to know where the flat places are. And it's just easier to build and play and host if it's a flat. And so one thing that you can see in this drawing is the major historic buildings and the major flat sort of plateaus, and then the boundaries of steep topography that make those different spaces. This is a much more technical drawing, but one of the things that we heard clearly was that access is a major, major goal. And people want to walk, and they want it to be fair, and they want small, little people to be able to walk easily, and they want people who have mobility challenges or maybe are on a walker or in a wheelchair also to be able to get around the island. And so this drawing shows the very steep slopes, the level flats, and the numbers represent the feet above sea level. And you can see, for instance, the distance between the polo field, which is down low, right about flood elevation, up to the stables. It's quite a big drop. And so one of the challenges that we're looking at as we go forward is how do we weave in these paths to connect everything together without doing harm to the wonderful rocks and topography that are there. The other thing we really want to do as little harm to as possible is the areas of great ecological value. And so we've been working with biohabitats and also generous members of the community to understand where are the most tender or important places on the island in terms of ecological function and sensitivity. And so this is a drawing just identifying the dark colors as tier 1. Those are the areas like the wetlands, where the eagle is, of enormous sensitivity. Tier 2 is areas that have quite a bit of what is called connectivity and diversity. And so those are the next areas that we're seeking to keep most development out of. And then 3, which is a sort of lighter green color, those are areas that have seen a lot of disturbance and change in the past. There's plants there, there's life, so as much as possible we want to be careful working in those areas, but those are the areas that have been pastures or gardens or other kinds of activities. And so we're feeling pretty comfortable that if we have to make some changes and incorporate some paths, those are good areas for us to do that in. And then the white areas in this drawing are the areas that are actually so sort of disturbed and maintained for human use already that we're completely comfortable continuing to support community activities in those areas. So, 3 possible futures for discussion today. And you can see that we've organized them on a sliding scale. This is really for the purposes of conversation and decision making as a community. The first scenario we're going to discuss is about connected open spaces, and this is the idea that still working with a kind of lobes and sense of amazing discovery, we would make more of an open ground. We would develop more. We would invest more different organizations, and things could happen on the island. Still, large areas of the island would be protected as natural, and the sense of really getting away would still be part of the experience on the island. In the middle is an idea that we take the biggest sort of character zones, we call them, so the lowland in the center, for instance, the upland by the greenhouse, the stables to the polo field out to Ziegler's Cove, and then the great lawn that the State House is on. And we carve out larger areas that make sense for a set of programs, we call them, or activities. And in between those spaces are woods and nature. And then the third option that we're looking at is really trying to make what we're choosing to call pockets of space around those historic buildings and conditions, and as much as possible starting to encourage the woods to grow back and really starting to remove even some of the structures that don't have enormous historic significance. We wanted to share today a couple of things that seem likely to need to happen pretty soon on the island that we wanted to put out there. So we think you need to have cars. We've heard that clearly from most of you. And so our thought is there's a big flat area by the boathouse, which has already been disturbed for a long time, and that it makes sense to put a modest-sized parking lot there. It's very close to how you get onto the island, and then you can put those cars behind you and go explore. Another, I think, set of ideas is to really start to support outdoor gatherings and events on the 2 big lawns, right? And we don't have to do that much to support that, making sure that there's a place to go to the bathroom, making sure that there's a place to throw out your trash, making sure that there's a place to sit. These can be very simple changes, but important changes. And then there are a couple of places, those of you who care a lot about the environment are probably aware of, where there are invasive challenges. And in the case of the Phragmites, which is one of our invasive water plants, views are interfered with, and even getting into the water is more challenging. And so we want to prioritize a couple of moments to really start to take care of the environmental health of the island. When it comes to the buildings themselves, there are also a set of relatively discrete projects that we want to support early on. So this making of bathrooms, restrooms, is absolutely necessary. Having those be close to where the cars are and relatively close to where people come onto the island is important. We have discovered that underneath the greenhouse, there's a vast root cellar, which you can see in this photo, and it is perfectly located for where we think we need bathrooms on the island. And so the idea of converting that sort of hidden space into a place for people to wash their hands and be comfortable is an idea that we want to recommend. We also know, and those of you who came to one of our fall meetings had the chance to come to the stables with us, but that the stables have been in public use very recently, and they're in relatively good shape. And so making some modest investment to the exterior areas outside and potentially to some of the interior might enable us to start to have some kinds of community events there in pretty short order. And then similarly at the Estate House, doing a full-fledged renovation may be very hard, but making some improvements to some of those exterior areas and finding a way to have some bathrooms and some drop-off for people is a way that events could start to happen there that we think is quite feasible, again, in the very near term. And then the last project to share is There's a complete gem of a building called the Carriage House. It is small. It does need immediate attention, so it doesn't actually fall apart. We feel it's a perfectly sized space to do classes, to gather people, to welcome them, to have another moment for bathrooms on the island. And it seems just like a truly ideal project to create an interior space for people to take shelter and start to come together and learn more about the island and other things. So those are ideas that are held true in all of the options we're about to share. But now I just thought I'd walk you through a little bit of storytelling so you can imagine some of what we mean as we talk about high intensity versus low intensity development. So for instance, if we think about the higher activation or high intensity uses, at the greenhouse, we might rebuild greenhouses, right? We might have community gardens. There might be some programming of even something like a restaurant or a cafe or that is involved in food production. And so there's kind of a whole world that starts to emerge around food and growing as you come onto the island. At the Great Lawn, where you can see the stables in the background, the idea that we might have a play structure or something that you can take shelter out of the weather, that there would be event infrastructure so that a band or food trucks or something not very, potentially occasional, but that we would be able to support more large activities for the community when it felt appropriate in that space is an idea. On the estate house lawn, we have heard again and again from you that you're interested in being able to have ceremonies and things like weddings or anniversaries, but hosting large festive occasions on that lawn or in that building. And so the idea that investments would be made to really support those kinds of events is what we would consider under this level of activation. Going back to the carriage house, which I already talked about, there are even choices. We're saying no matter what, we want to make improvements and take care of that building, but if you wanted it to really work for an art exhibition or a small, concert, there's a set of provisions that need to be made to support really having music in a good way or having truly wonderful gallery experience. So that would be a sort of slightly more enhanced version of the carriage house. And then at the beach, in our conversations about how to connect to the water, the beach is really a lovely location because it's not immediately at Ziegler's Cove, but it does have deep water. It's a graduated experience, so it also has the concrete plinth, for those of you who know it, so deep water kind of boat or a kayak, both could get into the water there. If we want to do that, having a structure that can support the people, but also the boats and the equipment that really make that work, there's an idea that potentially one of the buildings, most likely the squash building, could see a new future that would support that kind of marine connection. Switching to a middle ground, which, given what I've already learned about you as a community, is what I'm sort of imagining where we're going to end, because this is the compromise version. This is an idea where there are still improvements to the greenhouse, and perhaps there's a more modest version of a little bit of cultivation. We would potentially have a pollinator meadow there and a mown area where events in the community could come together. On the Great Lawn, the polo lawn in front of the stables, potentially we would make lesser provisions in terms of infrastructure, but enough to have smaller level pop-up events, some sporting events, maybe an occasional polo game as an example. And then in front of the estate house, the idea that smaller gatherings, maybe one large terrace that could host something, would be committed to, and some bathrooms so that it's comfortable for people who are there for larger events. At the carriage house, a sort of middle ground solution is to prepare that building for classes, but nothing, sort of more polished or expensive than that. And then at the water, maybe a more modest structure for a little bit of boat storage for boats that could be run by a partner organization. And then thinking about perhaps the most modest set of changes that could be made on the island long term. lower activation possibilities. Here, if you think about the same environment around the greenhouse, perhaps we just have some pedestrian paths. Maybe they're even just mown. We would like to restore the meadow. And here, again, we do want to have some restrooms. I think the idea that actually the polo field the Great Lawn just become a place for play and informal activities, that we don't commit to supporting large events, but it is open for use as the community sees fit, in front of the estate lawn, making sure it works for picnics and smaller gatherings, but no really significant investment to support large ceremonies or events. At the carriage house, the most modest thing we could do is sort of shore it up and have it just be an interpretation center with some bathrooms. And then perhaps, radical to consider, but we know that the structures right at the beach are in danger of being wiped away by a storm, and so in some ways the simplest thing that could be done is to just remove them now and return the beach to a more natural condition, and we might say that whole part of the island is really about nature, and we remove the buildings, and all of the activity and structures are kept more to the east. I'm now going to invite Michael, my colleague, to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of the things that you've all been very animated about, and so we want to go into a little bit of detail with you on those subjects. Come on over, Michael.
Thank you, Becca. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Weidman. Becca just walked us through some potential programming options for these different spaces. I'm going to walk us through some additional scenarios in more detail, specifically related to circulation and access. So considering all these different program options, the question now that we are asking ourselves, and also we'll be asking you to consider during our workshop this afternoon, is how do you access these spaces and how do you navigate through them? How do you access the island and navigate the island itself? As Becca mentioned earlier, we feel strongly that for both safety and experiential reasons, the pedestrian experience and the vehicular experiences should be separated on the island. We heard very clearly in our two surveys that went out in September and November respectively that 98% of survey respondents indicated that walking trails will be very important on Great Island. And so prioritizing that pedestrian experience will be very important as we move forward. Also, 96% of people indicated that in the town of Darien, they use vehicles to access public space. This is versus 45% people walking and 19% people biking. 71% of survey responses also indicated that they would very likely or definitely use daily parking on Great Island. And so our instinct is that that parking wants to be very quiet and as invisible as possible, but it is still something we need to consider and incorporate. So some historical context before we talk about circulation. My assumption is that almost everyone here has been to the island at least once. And for all of you, it will be no surprise that there is a looping road network on the island. This is original to the Ziegler estate. But the entire loop was not actually all built the same. As you may have noticed in the historic photos that Becca showed on the screen, the original way people accessed the island was via the stone causeway, so the causeway on the south, the one that's in green. And that's the one that has stone walls and almost feels like a bridge. The second one, which is made out of earth, was not installed until around the 1940s. And so in that original looping network, you came in via the stone causeway, looped around the south on the green line, and then continued on to the estate, the outbuildings like the stables, the carriage house, and the greenhouse on the northern, the yellow half of that loop. This meant that the family, the Ziegler family and their guests would have arrived directly to the estate house via this southern green portion of the loop. And then people perhaps hired by the family or people working in these service buildings would have used the yellow portion of the loop to get to those recreational and service buildings. And you can still see evidence of that today when you're on the island. The southern portion, the green portion, is very decorative in nature. There's these beautiful stone walls that sort of line the driveway. Different portions of it have decorative cobble shoulders, which are very nice. It's also much more meandering and follows the coast in a very beautiful way. Once you get past the estate house, those details stop, and the drive feels much more utilitarian. It's much straighter. It feels much more domestic and rural, and you can see photos of the different portions of the loop here on this screen. So building upon this foundation, there's a few different circulation options that we're going to look at. The first potential future is that pedestrians arrive via the northern causeway, so the earthen causeway that was introduced in the 40s, and that whole northern service portion of the loop is for pedestrians. That would mean that the southern portion of the loop would be vehicles, and this would be very similar to the way that people were originally meant to arrive on the island, via that stone causeway and along the south of the island to various parking spaces. In this scenario that we have on the screen right now, we're imagining that if you're arriving by car, you would come along that southern causeway, and right around the boathouse, you would sort of turn upwards towards the greenhouse and stables. And at the boathouse, the greenhouse and stables, there would be some form of parking. We don't really know how many spaces yet. That's to be determined once we determine more clearly what the building uses will be. And then for the remainder of that southern portion of the loop, there may be some level of temporary vehicle access for the public to access the estate house, rather, when there are special events happening there. That would mean, in order to separate pedestrians and vehicles, we would need to introduce a new pedestrian path sort of along the south of the island. The implication of this scenario, because the southern drive is actually quite narrow, especially where we have those stone retaining walls, is that some portions of the stone walls would need to be removed in order to make sure that roadway is navigable for two-way traffic and also emergency vehicles. I should also mention, before I talk about the second scenario, in these diagrams, the dashed lines are indicating new roads, and the solid lines are indicating vehicle or pedestrian paths on existing roads. The orange is pedestrian, and the green is automobile traffic. So this second scenario is very much the inverse of the first. We actually have pedestrians arriving on that beautiful meandering southern portion of the road, and vehicles are coming in towards the south. We have the same sort of parking configuration. We have parking at the boathouse, the greenhouse, and the stables, but how you access that parking is a little bit different. Again, the lighter green line is more of that temporary vehicle access for special events happening at the stables or the estate house, and the lighter green P is indicative of temporary parking options. Because now we're using the whole North Road for vehicles, that means we would need to introduce a new pedestrian path towards the north of the island to complete a pedestrian looping circuit. The third scenario is one where actually vehicles aren't permitted to go any further east than the stables. They arrive on the southern causeway, similar to the first scenario, and turn up towards the greenhouse and stables. But that would leave the majority of the historic roads for pedestrians. However, depending on what happens at the estate house, there could still be some sort of shuttle drop-off there for events. Yes. So this is just a summary of those different scenarios side by side. The next portion we're going to talk about is accessing the water. 67% of survey respondents indicated that shoreline and coastal areas were very important to conserve. 82% indicated support for sensitively integrated coastal walkways or boardwalks, and 70% were in support of having some level of kayak or canoe or paddleboard launch or storage. So there, again, there's a spectrum of options we're considering for accessing the water and how you get pedestrians from that main pedestrian circuit we just shared to the water. So in the first scenario, which is a little bit more intensive and higher investment, would be a continuous looping walkway along the shoreline of the entire island. The second scenario, scenario B, would be smaller loops that just access key moments on Great Island's coastline. And then the third scenario is just sort of pinpoint out and back trails that take you to either a bench or maybe a picnic table or just a beautiful scenic lookout. And you could imagine these a little bit as a spectrum in the sense that scenario C could be an early phase implementation of something like scenario A. There's also questions about water access, where people actually get into and out of the water with something like a kayak. There's scenario A is an option where there's multiple water access points. Scenario B is where we introduce infrastructure and clean up the beach, the existing beach, to provide some level of water access for visitors to the island. And then scenario C is where you actually introduce a new water access point in Scott Cove, which is much more sheltered than Ziegler's Cove. And so here is sort of a summary slide showing all those things overlaid onto one another, indicating these sort of broad ideas and how they might overlay to create sort of complete scenarios. I'm now going to pass it off to George, who's going to talk about the structures and architecture on the island.
I'm just going to request that you stay with us an extra 5 minutes because we want to keep talking a little bit longer.
I'm George Knight from Knight Architecture, and I will be succinct. I'm really happy to be able to speak to you about the built structures on the island, which, as you know, are extraordinary. And I'm looking into the audience and seeing so many faces who have helped us come to understand those structures and who will continue to guide us as we move forward. And we're all grateful for that, the sharing. We've learned a lot about the buildings themselves. And the first thing is really the architecture itself is a draw, that people are taken by it, and it's extraordinary, and unto itself it is important. That we largely want to use these buildings, put them to use for the town in a way that perhaps had not been originally conceived, but that is still totally viable. We know that we need to make them accessible in a number of different ways, but we want to do that so that we never undermine the building's integrity or their character. And finally, we want to use wise, prudent, future-sighted improvements ecologically, materially, et cetera, so that we can be confident that the island that we are giving to our grandkids is truly fit out for their lives. Fundamentally, the issue of access is the key part for us. We're very interested in conservation, as I mentioned, ecological construction and historic preservation unto itself. But to make these buildings, to transform them, as Becca so eloquently described, from an entirely private use to a public use is a jump. And that's where I think a lot of important thinking has to occur on a scale that ranges from the mundane to the profound. So I think we have to think hard about hazardous material abatement and mechanical systems and electrical systems and even sprinklering. That we have to think about new program uses, things that hadn't been imagined when the buildings were first built. We have to think even to, again, consider that which we've inherited from, let's say, our great-grandparents and that which we want to deliver to our great-grandchildren. All of that, I think, is in our mind as we think about what to do with these buildings. Our process has begun with a careful assessment of the physical buildings themselves. And I could share dozens of slides. I won't. I can simplify it to offer what is probably unsurprising to you all. One that, and it's sort of a good news and bad news pill. The good news is that these are incredibly well-built buildings. They are stout construction, robust, and that they are really magnificent. It is also the case that they are, by and large, have had very little maintenance, and in some cases have been effectively abandoned for more than 50 years. So it will surprise none of us that there's a dramatic amount of work that needs to be done in that particularly hostile to buildings environment of Long Island Sound, which you all, I'm sure, know better than I even. We have also asked ourselves, what is it that confers character to this place? So that we can be sure to be very thoughtful and protective of that. In our mind, there are at least 4 primary factors. One is the history of the Ziegler-Steinkraus family and their prowess in industry and sport and their influence on your town, Darien. The second, the fact that these buildings have been designed by prominent, both regional and nationally prominent architects. including Harry Knowles, who was the architect of most of the stone buildings, and then there are significant adaptations and even new buildings by Addison Meisner and William Lawrence Bottomley. The third criteria was that the spectacular coastal setting that weaves seamlessly landscape and building. And it's one of the things that I admire so much about it, and I think we probably all do. And then the fourth is, I think, manifest, but if you think about the region or even the mega region of the Northeast, this is a rare, rare property, and you all know it so well, but I can't think of anything that is like this in that very, very large extent. So those are criteria that we have in our mind thinking about things. We've asked the difficult question of trying to assign architectural significance to the buildings. And we've come with some confidence to 3 tiers. I'll quickly say that we think everything has significance that exists on the island. So we're simply trying to tier that. And in our minds, the most significant building is the stable building. It happens that it's actually, we think, in the best shape, which is a happy coincidence, but it features a single architect working with a very important structural system, the Guastavino tile. So those of you who've been in that stable building and seen those ceilings, those magnificent ceilings, which are in fantastic shape, knows that. And then just less, as a matter of significance, the estate house itself, which is a 1903 construction, but dramatically transformed in the 20s, again, by 2 prominent architects. The carriage house, which we believe to be Harry Knowles' work that Becca has spoken so nicely about. The boathouse on the waterfront. The greenhouse, which one sees as you approach, number 5. And then the playhouse, which has, in common parlance, has been described as the pink house, but really it was 1937 map that identified it as the playhouse. And that was precisely the reason it was built, as a nursery and play space for the Ziegler children. And then the third tier, some significance. It's really a grouping of wood frame buildings. The White House, which is important insofar as we think it's the oldest building, or at least parts of it are the oldest building on the island, dating back to 1920. The Beach Cottage, the bathhouse next to that, and then finally the squash court. All of those come in the 1930s. If there's time, I'll take you quickly through a set of ideas that apply to each one of the structures. And we'll do it very quickly, but I'll be next door and be very eager to speak with everyone about it. You see in the bottom there's a kind of a range, least intensive, most intensive. I think we could imagine that is tracking, for instance, the complexity of the construction, the care of the planning, the cost, the duration of the construction, et cetera. So we start with, on the left side, maybe the most simple use of the building, and then to the right, the most complex. So on the lower left diagram, Becca had alluded to this extraordinary elongated root cellar, which we feel could make a terrific set of bathrooms. And that would be something that we could do rather quickly without too much trouble. The building is occupied today as a residence, and surely it could still be so with rather maybe no alteration. Then again, if one wanted to take it a step further, as Beck had alluded, one could develop the greenhouses that are long since been demolished, but that could be still restored, left and right of the main house, and then perhaps some kind of not-for-profit lease to some organization, perhaps, for the house proper. That expands a little bit if we wanted to consider the possibility of including a visitor center there, which probably would be thought about relative to the circulation sequences that Michael had alluded to. The stables themselves, again, range from on the left side to the right side is the least to most extensive. And Becca alluded to this. I think we can think of the interior of the stables as an extraordinary thing, but I would say that the first room that one encounters with the stables is the forecourt, and it's magnificent. So it's a level ground, paved, that you enter through going through these magnificent historic iron gates. Left and right are beautiful stone loggias and an enormous door that leads you into the stable proper. So that as an exterior space is already, we have used it for an assembly space, and I feel like rather low-hanging fruits. Similarly, the wings on the first level, because they have ample access into that forecourt, feel like another very easy to imagine use, as well as the central zone of the stable itself. This then magnifies as one wanted to invest more energy into the building itself. You could imagine a visitor center located in this building or a portion of this building. One could imagine even some food and beverage use in this building. One could imagine utilizing the second story, which was really grooms' apartments, for some kind of office use. I think it would be easy to imagine that. And then in the most intensive use, you could actually utilize the entire second floor for some type of uses. Those of you may know that there are haylofts above the two wings that one could imagine become some kind of cultural educational use, simple labs, art studios, etc. So that represents a range of uses for the stable. The White House is tricky. It represents the oldest building on the island, but we've looked at it and we think there's rather little of that original house. And in some ways it's deceptive because that which looks particularly old is in fact not. So the facade, for instance, sits on a 1960s foundation. And we think that there are old elements in the house, but we can't even be sure if they themselves were part of the original 1820s construction. We think likely not. So that has to be brought into the thinking about this house and its futures. We put on the table one possibility that the house could be removed. I think it's fair to say that its highest and best use remains as a residence. It's very unadaptable to any kind of public use. The scale of the rooms, the scale of the circulation, the accessibility, all of that speak against finding any kind of public use for this building. So if it were to be carried forward, I think that is likely its use, either as some kind of a leased space, or if the manor house were to become a larger hospitality operation, it could be a residential offering within that much more magnified view. The carriage house, I don't think I'll need to say anything. So Becca has spoken to that perfectly. And then the estate house is, obviously very complicated. It's an extraordinary amount of effort to get it fully working again. One would want to start with the lower level if you wanted to start the work there. There is space that could be available on the upstairs with some work that could ultimately even be part of some kind of hospitality offering. And then the Playhouse, which probably is less well known to all of us, but is a lovely little building, we think designed by William Lawrence Bottomley. We think it could be a magnificent small office space or some kind of an office lease, or potentially, like one of the White House scenarios, an overnight accommodation. The Boathouse is a magnificent building. I think in no circumstances would we imagine removing it. Its use is harder to establish, in part because it sits within the FEMA flood zone and the 100-foot setback from the coastline. So we're very seriously constrained as to what we can do for it, but we're working quite hard to understand what those uses might be, because we want to use it for public use. And then there's a grouping of structures at the beach which have the same situation wherein they exist within the flood zone, the FEMA flood zone, which severely limits what we can do with them. They are not in particularly good shape, and I think that their development is a harder question. Becca alluded to the possibility that they would be demolished or relocated is another possibility, or simply remain as storage buildings. But we don't see a future for them where they could really be used in a robust public way. This is a matrix that I'll stop on. Thank you.
So just super briefly, the next activity is in the gymnasium. I already reviewed the kind of future. We are inviting you all to come and talk with us immediately down the hallway. And then, I already reviewed the schedule. Please participate in the survey. There are many ways you can access it. There's a poster describing these, but please visit the website, check out the social media, come to our next event, and come and talk with us right now. Thank you.
Some of the dormers in the Coast Valleys. I would like
Why would you have all? It's not a book. It doesn't really count. Well, it'd be, yeah, I feel like you can tell
I'm taking someone who's with the brain. It's not. Support up here, guys.